Well, now that I am back in the country and ready to talk about Gran Turismo 7 1.43, of course, a few days have passed since it dropped on Thursday, and there's been plenty of time for anyone to, if they want to, check out the vehicles. I know some of you like to wait for these overarching reviews to either consider whether or not to come back, or you just have no plans of coming back anyway, but want to check out what's new, what's happened in the game. Now, of course, we had some engine swaps this time around again. I will, as always, be doing a separate brief video to add that to the master list. There's 5 new swaps for the 2017 shape GTR, the classic Toyota Sprinter, interestingly the late 80s Supra, a Suzuki Jimny is another one. That's probably one of the standouts for many people, especially being a more recent car, and interestingly, the GR Corolla. Like I said though, we will get into those in their own particular video. For now, this one, in terms of new cars, well, the pricing is interesting, because if you want to technically buy all of the new vehicles that you have access to, it will of course cost you 1.2 million credits. But the reality is, for anyone who doesn't care about Vision GTs, it will cost you 200 grand, because $1 million of that is for the Bulgari. Now, aside from the Bulgari, which I'll leave until last, because for many people they won't care as much, we will talk about it though, because I have some thoughts there. Let's kick off first of all with my thoughts on the Evo. This is probably the standout for many people. Personally, I was the most keen to see what the Renault would be like. Of course, I'll talk about that in a second, and as always, I will talk about each of these in their own overarching reviews in the coming week on the channel. First of all though, for the Evo, you're looking at standard numbers of 100 grand to buy it. Interesting choice of price. I'm not exactly sure why they priced it that way, but you're looking at 277 horsepower, just over 1400 kilos stock, of course four-wheel drive, turbo, and the point level is just over 500. When you tune it up though, which of course I've just skipped to the point of fully upgrading these vehicles to see what they can do, you're looking at well over 500 horses. Still, not quite as crazy as you might hope. I am curious to see if any kind of engine swap becomes available for the Evo. It's interesting though, because the Subaru Imprezas and the Mitsubishi Evos haven't really had a strong selection at all of engine swaps in this game compared to usual. You've got the Escudo for the Evo 10, but it's arguably not necessarily that great of an engine, because it's got such chronic turbo lag. For my thoughts on this car overall though, I actually quite like it. Now, it sounds like an obvious thing to say, who wouldn't like an Evo, but I've actually never been a huge fan of the Evo 9. It's one of those Evos which, to me, I don't dislike, but I always kind of considered it to be in a bit of a no man's land. The Evo 8 is super iconic, the FQ400 is awesome, the Evo 10, of course, being the last in the line, has a huge amount of love, especially in the UK. You see probably more Evo 10s than anything else. Again, the FQ400, the FQ440, the Evo 9 kind of, it almost feels like an Evo 8.2, which in some ways it kind of is. But interestingly for me, my favourite version of the Evo in terms of one which I would actually want to own is probably based on the 9. The Evo 9 wagon with the GTA style Tiptronic gearbox. That of course is not the one that we have here in the game though. The one which we have here is the 2006 MR GSR. So in terms of upgrading it, it's not as crazy powerful as you might hope, but being an Evo, if it's already quick with 270, of course it's going to be ballistic with about double that, around the 540 region. And it's tremendously fast, but of course the crucial thing from an Evo of any generation is it's very forgiving. Much like the Evo that I had for a brief time in real life, the Evo 7 GTA, it's such an easy car to drive quickly that it actually is kind of deceptive. It's why I think you end up seeing so many people crash Evos, because much like the Nissan GTR, you kind of get a bit too confident sometimes because it's such a forgiving vehicle. You can take corners at ridiculous speeds, and it feels like the car is always going to save you. In the reality, of course, it's not going to always save you, but in a game, you can do that without the risk of crashing, or more accurately, without the risk of paying for that crash in terms of cash and your life. I would say the choice of 100 grand as a price tag is a bit odd, but for many players, of course, you won't care about that. It's not exactly difficult to earn that kind of money in the game. Let's move on then to the next one. I'm going to skip over the Audi until third and talk about the Renault second. This is the one which, aside from the Vision GT, is a genuinely new debut for Gran Turismo. It's the one which I was keen on to see maybe for a rally build, and because of the visual upgrades, you can make a pretty nice rally build out of it, Dakar style with the big mud flaps, and you can either delete the chrome from the front end or you can add the rally lights to it. It's a pretty awesome looking little car. In terms of upgrades, it's not that crazy. You're looking up around the, say, 110, 115-ish horsepower region, depending on if you go for a low, medium, or high range turbo. Personally, I bought all three, but I'm going more so for the low range, because it gives you a nicer amount of instant torque, and having low range, especially in the 100 horsepower region, it just gives you that better immediate acceleration, and who really cares about top end anyway? The visual mods really do seal the deal for me, with this one being a cool little classic. For many players, you probably won't care. It's 24 grand from the regular used dealer, not from the legendary one. And then if I turn my attention to the Audi's a funny one, and I don't know if anyone else felt this way about the Audi, but it doesn't feel new. And I know technically that's because it isn't, it's just a returning car that we used to have in GT6 anyway, but more so than that, it feels like it was already in the game. And I think it's because there are multiple different versions of the TT already, including the racing version, etc., that it kind of just feels like we've already had it, and you're just carrying on using something that was already there. It does have some pretty nice visual upgrades. I've done mine in kind of an MTM, the Moto TT kind of visual style. Funnily enough, just like the Evo, because of course the TTS has that 2-litre turbo engine, rather than the more expected 3.2, you can get some pretty decent numbers out of it. Interestingly, up around the same kind of region as the Evo. This one would not surprise me in terms of having an engine swap in future. I could easily see it with like a 911 engine of some kind, and if they do that, of course it will be even better. For now, I would say it's pretty good, but it's not necessarily amazing. The TT is very well proportioned, almost Beetle-esque in terms of being quite squat and wide, but also with the four-wheel drive, which it's so famous for, it's so easy to use. With 520, 530-ish horsepower, of course it's going to be quick, but with that being said, it's only a couple of seconds quicker than my fully built Toyota Alphard minivan. Now granted, that had the 700 horsepower V10 engine, but still it's a 1500 kilo minivan, using the same kind of tyres and upgrades as this thing, so to only be 2 seconds quicker is interesting. It puts it into more of a perspective how quick this actually is. It's great to use, but aside from the pretty cool visuals, I don't think it's really going to bring too much to the table that you're not expecting it to do. And then to of course briefly talk about the Bulgari. This one I think was an exercise in everything that's wrong about Polyphony's marketing alone. Forget how they do updates, forget the frequency of them, just put that all to one side and completely focus in on just how bad the community communication is. This is a prime example of it, one of the best so far. This should never have been announced in the previous update. It was not a part of the update because we could not get it, and for the very, very rare few who happened to buy a very expensive watch in order to get it, well, that means it's not part of the update. That was early access. So if they'd have redone that, if I, for example, had any kind of authority to, suggest or plan a roadmap for how these things were going to drop, I would have completely reversed it. Don't even show that car in the trailer for last month. Release it as a secret early access thing for those owners, so then it feels even more exclusive, but then have it in this trailer so that it arrives this month. Because think of it this way, back in January, people expect less anyway, in all kinds of things from YouTube to gaming to whatever, it's that time of year, so less people would have been disappointed, and then this month, it would have meant you could have 4 cars in the trailer at least instead of 3, because aside from the 3 new vehicles, and for some people the Bulgari, if you care about it, again, I'll talk about the Bulgari in just a second, but it's a fairly mediocre update. I mean, it doesn't add many career mode events. It adds some new Scapes in the Pyrenees region. And as I touched on, even in terms of those new events, there's one new collector's book for Lamborghini, which will take some people longer than others, depending on how much you want to spend on classics from the legendary dealership, but it's not exactly like this update is really bringing that much that's new. For many people, you will probably only care about the Evo. And unless you care about classics, random returning Audis, or maybe Vision GTs, there's not that much else to look at in this one. So it's pretty much an Evo update, and that's it. It's like having one bonus car for many players. There's certainly stuff to love and stuff to find if you want to, but I'm trying to approach this as more of the general player, which, let's be honest, is what these updates are supposed to appeal to, because it certainly isn't for the esports crowd. So if you're not appealing to them, well, naturally, you are assumedly trying to appeal to the rest of us, and for many of the rest, the Evo is the one which many people were asking for. You don't see people clamoring for the TT, you don't see people clamoring for a Renault 4, and you certainly don't see people generally clamoring for a Vision GT, so the Evo is the standout. The Evo had to be good. Thankfully, being an Evo, it's a pretty safe bet that it is, and it is. But aside from that, having no circuit yet again is a very strange choice. I do feel like they're almost having the approach to GT7 at this point that you would have when you're about to wind a game down and release the next one, which we have no indication, at least officially, that they will be doing that, so that's a strange approach to take. Again, indicating that they don't seem to really care who's actually playing the game or not, unless they're doing it purely for esports. And yeah, ultimately it's just kind of a weird one. It's almost a nothing burger of an update for many people. I feel like even being a few days late to covering it doesn't really make any difference. It's not like I've missed anything that was so radical that I had to get my hands on it, to the point where on Friday, when I did the stand-in video ahead of time for Gran Turismo 6, where I talked about the Lamborghini SV, that car alone would have had way more hype than anything except for maybe the Evo in terms of coming back. And yet it's a car which is just from Gran Turismo 6 still. It holds up pretty well for graphics, but you know what I mean. And even in terms of the engine swaps, well, again, I'll talk about that in its own video, but there's one, probably, key engine swap out of all of them for the Suzuki Jimny that many people will have already done, and it's, spoiler alert, a Suzuki Swift engine. Doesn't sound like much of an update in terms of a swap, but it allows the car to have a lot more horsepower, which is a pretty great little update to have, certainly for a rally build, and I will be touching on that in some form or another, probably in future. Yeah, that's pretty much it for my thoughts. I mean, there's not much to talk about, and it really is as simple as that. If you think I've missed something in this update, or if there's some kind of weird glitch, or maybe point changes, or certain tuning that does work now that didn't before, or the other way around, maybe something that you used to use that doesn't work quite as well, then of course you could drop that down below. But I would be curious, especially for those who have been driving everything and using everything since Thursday, have you noticed anything interesting that I've maybe missed? You'll notice I haven't talked about the Vision GT much, so we'll round out the video and close it off with that. This is one which I saw a few people complaining about in the comments in terms of it being quite bad for handling. I didn't really expect much of this car because it definitely seems to be more of a stylistic and marketing exercise more than anything, which, as I've said before, is my least liked out of all of the Vision GTs. From a design perspective, it depends on what it is. If it's just like showcasing the next face of the company, then I'm not as interested. If it's genuinely unique from a design perspective, something for example like the Genesis, which is a stunning car that's fairly unlikely at best to reach production, well, that I have a lot more time for, because it's, you know, imaginative, it's genuinely unique. Even then, many people don't like those. This one I think has very little going for it. The one thing I was really hoping for is that it would be super engaging and super fun to drive, and it kind of just isn't. It's just there. It's got 400 horsepower, weighs a ton, and with standard tyres at least, the sports ones that it comes with, and of course being a VGT you can't do much to it anyway, it's pretty tail happy. It's not necessarily that quick to work with. For its power level, sure, I guess, but I feel like many people aren't really bothered about the power level of a Vision GT most of the time, because you'll use a road car or something instead, like the Evo for example. You could use it in some forms of racing, as I am here, but there's not really that much to talk about. It's a slip-slidey, interesting looking kind of chopped-roof DeLorean looking thing, which was built to tie in with a watch, which is really what they care about, selling those watches, not people liking the car. So to me, it's kind of some of the worst parts of the Vision GT program. It feels like a fairly lazy car in terms of its physics and performance. It's really nothing to write home about, and honestly, I think the best way to describe how little this car actually matters is to compare it to something which is so similar in many ways, but if you imagine how many more players would have enjoyed this vehicle instead, and how much more use it would have had, plus having the nostalgia from those of us who used to play, you know, stuff like seasonal events and GT6, the Suzuki, the GSX-R4 concept. Very, very similar machine. Visually, it's quite similar with the paint and the matte black. Engine-wise, motorcycle powered, so again, some similarities there. Way less horsepower, and yet a car which was way more OP. You could use that thing to dominate certain forms of racing. It was still a concept car, but it was a real concept car, rather than a Vision GT, which was just a marketing exercise, and it comes from a brand which people already love anyway, like Suzuki, a brand which recently has had quite a lot of love, with the Vision GT, the Group 3 version, the Jimny more recently. A GSX-R4 would have been perfect in terms of timing, but instead we had this. That to me is a perfect encapsulation of when the Vision GT program kind of feels a bit lazy in comparison to a car which would have still ticked the box of imaginative, custom, concept creativity, but people would have enjoyed more. But maybe that's just me. But for now, that's it on my thoughts. Of course, I'll see you in the coming days for my thoughts on the vehicles, and for now, thanks for watching.